So here's a hit list that'll kind of give you a compare and a contrast, right? So this column over here, this would be what we find in Silverlight 1.0, the initial release. Here's what we have with 2.0, right? And I'm just going to kind of hit some of the highlights here. Remember that just like WPF, part of what Silverlight 2.0 is trying to do is to integrate diverse technologies. So directly within Silverlight 2.0, and that's what I'm focusing on here, right? We have support for doing animations and graphics, right? We have support in 2.0 for managed code, which to me is probably the biggest thrust, right? A real strongly typed object-oriented platform. But here's another cool thing. This is actually one of the big buzzes of 2.0. You know, in 2.0, we can work with Windows Communication Foundation. You know, on a typical web page, right, when you do a post back, you're going back to the same thing on the web server. Maybe you're getting new dynamic content, but you're typically going back to the same place. Well, you could have a WCF-enabled Silverlight control that goes to a whole different place, right, to maybe read some database or something, right? So that's actually really cool. You can get some really neat functionality there. And the demo that I'm going to run will show you that. Okay, we're going to have a Silverlight applet that plugs into a browser, and then it's going to go ahead and talk back to a different WCF service. Okay. Some of the other pieces are pretty clear. I've already talked about them. We have support for doing database access with ADO.NET, support for Link. We have our own little micro version of the base class libraries, so we're going to have access to things like some programmatic security, right? We have support to work with threads, so we can do things like async callbacks and code, right, with or without AJAX. Now, in addition to this kind of table of big pieces, we got a couple of really specific things just for 2.0, right? Isolated storage. That's one of those APIs in .NET that a lot of people don't know about, but it can be so useful, especially when you're running in a sandbox, right? So when we have a Silverlight plugin on a web page, you can make use of isolated storage. So you have a little safe area to do file I/O operations. Because, you know, if you're going to be loaded up from the internet zone, you have very limited access to that file system, unless you're using isolated storage. Right? So that's great. We have support for that. So you can persist things on the client computer, right? There's a complete asynchronous programming model. We all probably agree that HTTP is not the zippiest protocol known to humankind. So whenever we can do things on secondary threads, that's a good thing. In addition to just simply isolated storage, we also have some file I/O operations, really just about like file open, file save stuff, right, to appear on the client side. Another cool thing, though, we have a serialization stack, right? So we can go ahead and persist out, right, replicas, the state of our objects in various formats. And it's going to look and feel pretty much like you would use any of the formatters. And that's a natural tie-in to the fact that we also have support for link to XML, right? Now, maybe you haven't used all these things in your code today, but I'm sure you've heard about a lot of these terms and topics, right? And these are all specific to 2.0. So this is a great step forward to giving us a really lush playground to build up web content. So we have this little micro version of the CLR, right? And we have this little micro version of the base class library. And I think I've seen a lot of you before. You've all been around the block. You know what the CLR is all about, right? It's going to do things like handle your threads, manage your memory, right? It'll go ahead and just in time compile your SIL code. So all those things are still going to be true, right? And then, of course, we have that subset of the base class libraries. And I've already kind of hit on that through the last two slides, right? We've already seen, for example, some of the technology stacks. But when you make a brand new project for Silverlight in Visual Studio, and you look at all the referenced assemblies that you get, you might take a casual glance and say, oh, there's MS Core Lib, there's system.dll. Well, select that little icon and look at the path. It's a whole different MS Core Lib. It's a whole different system.dll, right? And that's that kind of micro subset I was talking about, right? Which is kind of lean and mean for effective web download. And the other cool thing, too, is that with this little micro set, you can really treat it as a real UI framework. So you could easily build your own Silverlight control libraries, right? Maybe you want to build up a bunch of common controls that a bunch of your plugins have to use. You can just bundle them up inside of a little DLL, and that will also be deployed to that end user's machine and will be hosted by that little mini CLR. Okay, so let's take a look at this documentation snapshot. This is directly from the Silverlight 2.0 documentation. Okay, and basically everything in the, I guess we'll call it dark yellow or bright orange, based on your eyesight, right? These are the new bits for 2.0. Let's talk about what they have in common, right? 1.0 or 2.0. So in either version of this model, there was support for processing user input, whether it be keyboard, mouse, or stylus, right? The Ink API. They both had support for some media formats, right? For video feeds and audio feeds and that kind of stuff. They have support for AJAX. They have JavaScript support, right? They had limited access to various distributed protocols, right? And they also had a UI core. That's where we got that initial look at XAML, back when 1.0 was released. But here's the big new stack here, right? All of the link and data support, big deal there. Now notice this, WPF, right? That's the term that they're kind of grouping all these technologies that are responsible for rendering the UI stack. And that can lead to some confusion, because you're thinking, wait a second now, I thought WPF was all about building desktop programs. Well, it is, okay? But remember, all these different parts of WPF have been kind of ported and massaged over to work in a Silverlight plugin, okay? And there's a couple of unfortunate byproducts of that I found out the hard way. For example, the XAML that we type in WPF is not the same exact XAML as we do in Silverlight, right? There's actually some dialects. There's WPF XAML and there's Silverlight XAML. And here's one of the things that I found out that was really a pain in the butt. When you're writing XAML for a WPF program, you typically want to give everything a name, right? Because that generates the member variable in the code file. And as a convenience in WPF, we don't have to actually have the X qualifier. We don't have to say X:name, right? We get that as a freebie. Well, in Silverlight, you must. So think of that, right? I was taking the easy way out, writing the XAML for a WPF program. I thought, hey, that's a good control template. I'll try it over here in Silverlight. And I got tons and tons of markup errors. So I had to go and manually reapply X:, So, word to the wise. If you're writing XAML today, and you're thinking, yes, I want to reuse this in a Silverlight plugin later, use the X:, wherever you possibly can, right? But beyond that, things are going to structurally look and feel pretty much the same, right? XAML is still essentially the same XAML, right? With a couple limitations for a web-based model. But you kind of get the gist of what we're seeing here from this high level. Any questions right now on this idea of a mini CLR or a mini base class library? Yeah?
Making a garbage collection, if you can call, to remove,
Yeah, in the system namespace there's a GC. Yep. Yeah?
Do you have the full threading model like you do?
Not a complete, full threading model, but pretty much everything you need for your day-to-day stuff. Some things aren't there.
You don't have the thread class, all the thread classes?
Right, you don't have the whole, it's not a complete replica of what we have in system.threading today. But it's a healthy stack.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's the thing I want everyone to remember. It is going to be a limited subset. You know what I mean? It's not going to be every possible thing, but it's going to be a lot of stuff. Okay? I'll take one more question over here.
how does the subset of the ECL here compare to the subset in .NET Compact?
I don't do a lot of compact programming, so I'm not exactly sure. But if you look at the Silverlight documentation, and I'll pull it up here in a little bit, it'll actually break down every single namespace, much like the MSDN documentation. So I'm not exactly sure, but I'll show you the help system in a little bit. Okay?